Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We've got Anthony Grimani, David Frangioni, Gene Della Sala, three Italianos on one live stream. What's going to make of this?
This is going to get tough.
It is going to get tough.
Great to see you guys.
I'm so glad to see you guys all here.
I made you an offer that you couldn't refuse. I had to have both of you guys on. And this is a very important topic. We're going to be talking about Atmos mixes. You know, what's going on between the theatrical mix versus when you get it home and you play it either through a streaming service like Netflix, HBO Max, Amazon Prime, versus playing the optical disc or Kaleidoscape. Anthony's got some interesting slide presentations to talk about his experience. Of course, David Frangioni does Atmos mixing. He mixes Atmos music. So we're going to get two different takes on this, and we're going to share our experiences with you guys and then give you some advice on how to get the best possible sound in your home theater when you're watching your favorite content. What do you guys say about that?
I love it.
Great.
All for it.
Awesome. So, Anthony, I think you have a slide presentation. If you want to share that, you're more than welcome to get that going, and then we could kind of interject on our thoughts on that.
As you know, I always love to do the stuff with a PowerPoint to kind of make my points. It also keeps me from drifting. I drift anyway. So let me start with that. So let me hit this. Am I the one who has to hit a share, or do you share this? Remind me.
You should be able to do it. You just hit share and then you go to slides.
Share screen. There it is. I can see it. Yes. Excellent.
Somebody noticed my Batman Year One shirt. I can't wait for that movie to come out.
Excellent. So I'm actually going to try this differently today. Let's put that over here. I'll put it over here. Sorry. This you now have an option to share multiple screens on this live stream. So let's do this. Can you confirm that you see my slide here?
We are there, and you could talk with your hands on the side if you see that.
I love it. Cool. So my slides are about the concept of sound quality referencing, and that kind of leads my interest. I know that it gets really complicated when you look at all the different versions. David Frangioni's got a ton of info on this, on what are various versions of releases that the various formats can do. But I wanted to just chat about this. First, I just want to be clear that when it comes to a film soundtrack, there is a standard of quality, which is a film studio mix room and a screening room. Those are built on very defined standards. The electroacoustics, the acoustics, the way the sound is in there, the levels, the relative levels, the relative delays are all highly standardized. And what I mean by standardized is that there's a rule book, and there's actually two of them, from both the ISO and the International Standards Organization and SMPTE, the Society of Motion Picture Television Engineers, about how these rooms should be built and how you tune them so that whether you're sitting in this room, which is at Skywalker Ranch in Northern California, or any one of the studios in New York or London or Paris or LA, the sound is consistent. You should actually, if you take the same track and you play it in all these different rooms, all built on these standards, they're going to give you the same experience. Screening rooms are also built on that. This is the main screening room also at Skywalker Sound in Northern California, where I used to work. Now, our mission in the business of high-end home cinema is to replicate that experience in rooms like this. So this is a high-end home cinema that was built by Audio Images in Orange County in Southern California. It was designed by our design group. It was equipped with Grimani system speakers, all tuned to the standards. So the standards, which are well documented using all the industry approaches at how to do this right. And then in the end, it's listened to make sure, this sounds on soundtracks I know well, it sounds just like it did on the dubbing stage on the mix room. So that's the concept of referencing, is the idea that when you sit in this room, you hear the quality of dialogue, the tonal balance of dialogue, the dialogue relative to the sound effects relative to the music, relative to the reverb, the stuff that's in front of you versus the side, versus the top versus the back, is all not just a random event, but is all what the director intended, what the sound designer intended, what all of the people that were sitting in this room heard originally when making the track. So that's our mission. Now, the reason we're here today is to talk about, well, so we can build rooms that have the capacity to fulfill that mission. But is the software that we're playing on there actually going to render that? And that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time. So when I talk about reference elements in those rooms, there are the issues of tonal balance, and those are well documented in these two engineering specs and specifications. There's also spatial balance and immersion, which is really dictated by the interchannel levels. You want to make sure that over a certain range of frequencies, the level of the left and the center and the right and the wide right and the first set of side right and the back rights and all the way around to the lefts and the tops all have the same levels. And you get there by making sure that the amplitude and phase response are also consistent. So just the fact that the level of the left and the center are the same, if their frequency response or their phase responses are different, things aren't going to quite tie in. And a lot of effort is put into the work in mix rooms and dubbing stages and in proper high-end cinemas to make sure that the interchannel level and the interchannel frequency and phase response is consistent.
So real quick, Anthony, does room correction systems like DRAC or Odyssey, would that help with any of this, or do you think it could make it potentially worse?
No, in theory, it should help. I don't want to go into a whole tirade about room correction systems. If they work correctly, they should get the interchannel levels and the phase responses and all of that right. The thing I'm just going to say ultimately is they work as well as the microphone and the computer can work. And those are linear devices. The human hearing system is not linear. And there's a final level of fine tuning that's always important. Once you're done with either a manual EQ, room correction is not just an automatic thing. I've been doing room correction for 35 years, long before any automated system existed, using measurements and equalizers and listening. And that last part's really important. In the end, you got to give it a listen. Kind of like if you're cooking a really, really fine gourmet meal, you don't just follow the recipe. You actually put some of that in your mouth and go, ooh, is that working or not? Try not to eat too much of it or else you run out. But you do have to listen. And one of the problems with automatic room correction is it can't listen. And on some of them, if you hear that they're wrong, there's nothing you can do to tweak it. DIRAC does give you the ability to do some tweaking if you know how to get there. But however you do it, you got to expect that a speaker placed in a room is going to need some kind of tailoring of the speaker to the room, or else you're just not going to end up with the right results in these things. Finally, there's this little thing that I call interchannel time alignment. The sound from all the speakers needs to arrive at your head at the same time. The speakers like on the side or the back that may be closer to you need to be delayed digitally so that they have essentially the front speakers, which are then handicapped in terms of time, have time to get to you. And if you do not adjust them, the phantom images that are between those don't render right. The overall sound field doesn't render right. And the adjustments of 0.1 or 0.2 milliseconds make a big difference. And I know it sounds like I'm in complete heresy when I say that. Oh my God, here's a guy who's like, no, over 0.2 milliseconds, a sound that's supposed to come from half the way up the wall could change completely to the side or completely to the front left speaker because of the way the hearing system of a human being works. And I've shown this to many, many engineers and technicians when I'm doing calibrations. Hey, look at that. A little change, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 milliseconds can make a huge effect. And that you got to listen to. Once that's all done, you get the right immersion. You get, everything just locks in. It's really sweet. The other thing in referencing is the dynamic range, the difference between the quiet sounds and the loud sounds. A film mixer could make a movie with 10 dB of dynamic range between the loudest sounds and the quiet sounds. It would be a pity, but that could do that. If it's a movie that's just heavy on dialogue, the dynamic range is not going to be that big. If it's an action movie, the difference between the loudest peaks and the quietest little thing, could be close to 90 dB or 100 dB if you really push it. I would never advocate going that high, but you could do that. So the other thing that's really important is there's a certain bass quality in these dubbing stages and these big mix rooms that's really hard to get in a smaller home cinema. And with enough effort in bass optimization, which I know we've talked about plenty in these live streams, with proper bass optimization, you can get to the same bass quality and bass impact as you would hear in a larger mix room. Now, a thing has been going on for the last I'm going to say close to 20 years, if I remember right, at least 15 years, which is there's been some amount of either remixing or remastering, whatever you want to use for the word. But there's been a number of cases where the stems of a film soundtrack, the multiple channels, instead of being taken from the film mix and just pushed to the video release, are adjusted. And I'm going to talk about in a second about what those adjustments are. Is it right or wrong is one of the issues I have here. So one of the things we know is that a film soundtrack, when you take the original print master, the actual, it's still called a print master these days, even though nothing gets printed, but the actual original track that's designed to go to a theatrical environment, whether it's a 5.1, 7.1, 11 point something or something, an immersive audio, whatever, if you play it in a properly built small room, in a living room, whether it's 20 or 30 feet long, in a dedicated theater, it will sound just fine. It'll sound like the dubbing stage, with a few really small exceptions. The biggest one is it'll sound a little bit bright. And we'll talk about that a little later, but it'll sound just a tiny bit bright, and you can correct that with what's called re-EQ in the THX processors, or you can correct that in setting up the room to just turn down the top end. It's usually from 6 to 12 kilohertz. There's about 3 to 6 dB too much energy for long historical legacy reasons. Everything else renders correctly. So right or wrong to remix? Well, I was just in a studio, happens to be in New York, where I walked in, and I walked into a room that we designed many years ago that's completely referenced to all of the ISO and SMPTE standards, in which there's 3 speakers behind the screen that you see here. There's side speakers, some visible, some hidden all the way around. It's a properly built dubbing stage, a smallish one, but properly built. Actually, for New York, it's really big. And I saw this. I was like, hey, what's going on here? Oh, they're remixing all these tracks for home video release. Really? And so, is this correct? So let's look at this. You place a bunch of speakers on stands, right by the console,
in the near field,
clearly in the near field, 6 feet away from you, tuned to, I don't know what standard. I don't know if it was remeasured, if they were just plugged in, if they were equalized. Nobody seemed to know. And in which, because of the proximity of that speaker to the console, there's a giant console bounce that gives you some errors in the mid-range. And you've taken a room in which the sound from the screen speakers, the ones that are behind the screen that sound amazing, they're tuned well, they sound fantastic, and in which you can do a film mix that will translate just fine into a home environment. And now you're playing it back over these clearly near fields. And what I call near field is that the sound from those speakers to your head is largely anechoic. There's only 6 feet of distance. The room is relatively dead. You're only hearing the anechoic direct field, like giant headphones. And you're assuming that that's what is going to sound right in a home cinema. And, here's this room up closer. This is a side view of these speakers. These are excellent loudspeakers, by the way, from PMC. Really, really well-designed reference monitors. But does this sound like you should be doing this? So first of all, I've called a bunch of people I know. David, I'm going to invite a lot of your comments after I'm done with this, but this is what I'm hearing for the last 20 years is one of the reasons to take a track and maybe adjust it a little bit is there's a lot of dialogue clarity complaints once it goes out to streaming and people are playing it on their TV with speakers firing down. There's a lot of dynamic range complaints, which is, man, I turn the volume up on my TV or my little soundbar until I hear the dialogue, and boom, there's a giant effect, and it blows me out of the room. The TV, it's just, I can't stand it. So then I have to turn the volume down, and then I can't understand the dialogue. So then I turn the volume back up, and you're playing this game that's really a pain. There is a perception that there's a sound difference between a home cinema environment and a professional environment like that, which there isn't. It's a perception. There is sometimes a need of taking an Atmos mix, an immersive or something that was mixed for DTS or whatever it is, and down mix it to 5-point channel actively, not let the down mixing function in the field, in the consumer space, do that, because it doesn't always work right. And so sometimes there's a reason to remix, because we know we're going to release this as 5.1, not immersive audio, not Atmos, so we'll remix it down. Sometimes there's a belief that you got to rebalance it. That, well, the surrounds relative to the fronts are not going to sound the same in the home cinema. These are all perceptions. And then there's a perception that the X curve needs to be compensated. And I feel like it's not really needed. You could do it if you knew what you were doing, which is to apply this thing that's called re-EQ. If what I've just stated above is all about catering to the lower common denominator, which is the vast majority of clients, 95% or more of the clients that are watching these things on a 55, 65, 75-inch TV with the speakers firing down, you don't need to worry about the X-curve compensation. They're not complaining about what's happening between 6 and 12 kilohertz. They're complaining about dialogue clarity, and they're complaining about dynamic range. Those are legitimate complaints. So the issue for us on this channel, the people who are watching this, the audioholics, is they're not listening to the soundtrack with a pair of little racetrack speakers that are 1 inch wide by 3 inches, 1 inch deep by 2 or 3 inches wide, firing down. They're listening in rooms like this. Maybe not as well outfitted as this in terms of luxury, but this is our audience here, Gene. It's the people who care about the sound. And does this match this? It doesn't. So here's what's interesting about a room like this. I hear the term far field or near field bandied around a lot. And in one of the communications that you brought up in a recent email, David, I'll let you mention that later, it was thought of as that the home theater environment, the home video environment is a near field environment. Well, it's not. When you're sitting in this couch, 13, 14 feet away from those speakers in a room with normal acoustics, you're actually in the far field, which means that the reflection energy dominates the direct sound. That's far field. When you're sitting in here, 6 feet away from a relatively directional speaker in a totally dead room, you are in the near field. And the speakers that are in the screen, behind the screen, are sort of in a midfield. They're right at a transition point between directed and reflected energy transition. So they're a little bit more near field than the speakers here. So it gets kind of confusing when you actually look at it. Ultimately, when you listen to it, it don't match. So remixing, who is it for? It's for the basic TV customer that's typically streaming, typically using their TV with small speakers or maybe a small sound bar. It's not for the audioholics customer. And I'll be the first to say that while that's the customer I cater to, it's the customer, Gene, that you cater to, that is only, what, Gene? 1%?
Yeah.
Half of a percent? Let's not kid ourselves.
So let me ask you this, Anthony. Back in the day when we had, I always hear people saying the Laserdisc mix was the best for like Star Wars movies or whatever. Was that because those mixes were done as theatrical mixes as opposed to near field mixes that you're seeing now?
It's possibly that in those days nobody remixed anything. They just took the quote unquote print master, the actual original mag master, pushed it over to Laserdisc and encoded it with AC3, and that was the end of that. And that may be the reason. So my point here is these remixes are not for audioholics. They're necessary for this crowd, but they're not for the audioholics crowd. So now what? What do? Do we just stop buying good speakers? Do we stop putting good home cinemas together just because we can't get a decent mix? Or we're not sure? Well, not so. Could we actually ask for 2 release versions? Could we actually say, well, can you do a down res, 5.1 or 2-channel, mix with amplified dialogue with, forget about it. I forget about it. It's not going to happen. The film, if you think about the video companies that are releasing that and you think of how few of us there is, even though, Gene, you have an enormous following, that following is a very, 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 very small percentage of the worldwide households. So that's not going to happen. So my recommendation is to stick, if you really care about the quality of what you're watching, stick with Blu-ray or ultra Blu-ray, because you stand a better chance that what's put on there has not been heavily remixed or changed around. Or go for Kaleidoscape. This is not a plug for that company, because there's also other video vaults like Zapedi and other companies where you can actually buy a device, you can download the movies, and what you're getting is more the original track. So all is not lost. I just, my purpose in going on this tirade over here for 20 minutes is to make a point that while streaming has the capacity, to put out really good Dolby Atmos, no trouble at all. It's often at the source end that they have to. They're forced. The video folks are forced to down res it, or essentially treat it so that there's less complaints from the average customer.
So a question I have for you, and then maybe David could respond to this as well, since he does mixing. I was talking with, you guys know David Medina. He's from Warner Brothers, HBO. He's a production technology operations guy. He actually emailed us. We've been in communication for a while now, and I want to have him on this channel.
Gene, I just lost you. Did I?
I think we lost Gene.
Uh-oh, we lost Gene.
Gene, we don't hear you.
Let me mention this while Gene's reconnecting. I'm assuming if you can hear me, David, that I'm still on, right?
Yep, I can hear you.
Excellent. This is funny. Every one of these stream sessions, wherever it is, however I do it, it's always kind of like this. So, P.S. Lossy compression is not a problem. So I often hear people going, well, they have to compress it with a lossy compression, so the sound's not going to be that good. Not true. Dolby Digital Plus as a base for either 5.1 or 7.1, or as a base for immersive audio, is perfectly fine enough to be really close to transparent. And David, I'll look forward to hearing your comments on this. But years back when I was at Lucasfilm, we ran a bunch of listening tests of Printmaster 6-channel, 24-bit, 96 kilohertz Printmasters against a Dolby Digital encoded. We're talking probably 23 or 24 years ago. At the time,
when it was AC3.
It was AC3, and also we did it again with Dolby Digital Plus. And you could switch between the Printmaster and the transcoded one, so encode, decode, other than the latency of it. In the mix room in which the track was made, you couldn't hear a difference. There was no audibility of anything weird, no pumping, no zippering, no distortion. Let's just call it reasonably transparent at a high enough bit rate. You got to have a reasonable bit rate, which is perfectly available to us in streaming. So we do want the sound power. We do want to get this thing started and make sure that we can have the right sound quality. But I will stop sharing this so we can get back to shaking our hands and going around. So just as a conclusion, my fear is that in order to cater to the lowest common denominator, which I understand, the companies have to do that. Things are often or are sometimes essentially remixed, changed, mashed down so that the dialogue is clearer, so that the dynamic range is reduced, so that the bit rate is smaller, because the mass majority of the consuming public needs that. So what do we do, the people who watch this channel?
Yeah. So your thoughts, David, on the different mixes?
I think let me put some context to it. For 30 plus years, I've been on both sides of the equation as a professional. It's been a very unique career, quite frankly, because I don't meet many people who have put as much effort into both sides. Whereas I've installed a lot of home theaters, high-end home theaters, in the lane, that you travel, Anthony, and I've also mixed a lot of 2-channel and multi-channel. So the perspective, of course, is very, very different from each side. However, they're supposed to serve the same end result, right? So what I mix is supposed to be heard identical to what I mixed in a reference quality playback environment, such as the theaters or recording studios that are built, whether I built them or anyone else, or whether I mixed them or anyone else. So I have a vast amount of experience, I guess what I'm trying to say, on both sides, where I understand the mixing side, and I understand the playback side, and all of the steps that go into each of those. So that's the context. Now, specifically to what we're discussing with basically, mixes that don't don't translate in a reference quality playback room. As Anthony said, Kaleidoscape, 4K, Blu-ray disc, what that is all referring to, of course, is that you, as aficionados, right, the 1%, because that's, again, the context of what we're talking about, because there are many different playback systems, many different environments, and many different goals. And there are a lot of people, whether it's budgetary or otherwise, who don't have a goal of having a reference quality room. But we're specifically speaking right now to those like the three of us, and many of you listening, have a goal of a reference quality playback room. And with that goal in mind, we all focus on, the video projector, the room acoustics, the quality of the speakers, the amplifiers, et cetera. And all of those things are extremely important. But what we're talking about right now is the source. And the source starts with the content, right? So you could have a world-class playback device, let's say a very expensive streamer, whether it's, for audio only or like a Kaleidoscape. And it still is going to come down, if that's just, the weakest link in the chain, which in the case of a Kaleidoscape would be a strong link. Now it comes down to one last thing, which is the actual content, which is what we're talking about. So what's important to understand first and foremost, high level, is playback. Just like on the mixing side, we could go through a whole segment just talking about all the levels and steps of mixing. Same thing on the playback side. They're links in a chain. And the weakest link in the chain, whatever that is going to be kind of, that's where it's going to break down. So if every link is very, very strong, then you're going to have you're going to have an uncompromised reference quality playback system. If you have world-class acoustics with world-class video playback, with world-class audio electronics, and the source that you're feeding is, as Anthony described, a bad remix, coming from some, copy of a master that got put onto streaming or is on some third-rate app or whatever, and then all of a sudden that's going to be the weakest link. So it's never going to really be better than that. And so that's why it's so important to understand all of these contexts to it, so you can then look at your own system and say, okay, is everything else in check? And now I'm going to actually check whether my source content is up to standard. And if you're listening entirely from certain types of streaming devices, the first thing you have to check is the interconnect between the source playback itself. Let's use an Apple TV as just a simple example. It's one of many types of sources you could have. Is it, at this point, it really only has HDMI out. So theoretically, it's kind of hard to mess up, but you have to be using HDMI if you're going to get true Atmos playback. It's either natively going to be streamed out of some kind of decoder in a soundbar, television, etc. But in the kind of systems that we're talking about today to our audience, they're separate systems. So there's a dedicated video device, there's a dedicated audio processor, and the decoding has to come through HDMI. So that's the first thing. Once in a blue moon, you see a setup where they're using a SPDIF optical or coax, and they're wondering why they're maxed out at 7.1. So that's number one. So simple, but could be a cause of a problem. If all of your interconnect is correctly set up, the quality of the cables can handle the bandwidth, all of your source components and playback components are reference quality, and it really only literally comes down to the content and the actual playback capability of that source device. Again, Apple TV or Kaleidoscape. Now you have to look at what is actually being streamed. And that brings us now to the point that Anthony was making in his slide presentation about, well, what are we actually streaming? Does it contain the metadata and a decode capable Atmos mix or the like? Is it, a mono or a stereo mix from an old master? Is it a remix that was really intended for cable television or direct TV, etc.? And you have to be cognizant of that. Now, this is not a Kaleidoscape commercial, but I will say, because I've installed a lot of Kaleidoscape systems, I have one personally. And I've kind of followed their the last 20 years since they've been around, what they're doing technologically and where they are right now with the Stratos and the latest technology that they have, is that they really are a bit for bit playback system. So whatever is in the content that you're streaming from a Kaleidoscape, because remember, in a Kaleidoscape, you're not really streaming it in the true sense. It's not real time. Kaleidoscape downloads a bit for bit master to a hard drive, and then you play it back. So it's really nonlinear playback as opposed to streaming, whereas
Right.
Apple TV actually streams live, whatever, based on whatever your internet speed is. So all of this, again, context, manufacturers are making products for the 99%. Most manufacturers, especially source streaming component devices like Apple TVs, Roku's, cable boxes, they're for the 99%. They're not being made for our group here. They're not looking at what the best, video output card technology is, what the best hard disk playback technology is, what the best buffering system is, what the best DACs or clock devices for HDMI, jitter reduction. All of these things, they're not. That's what you get in the high end, where engineers are focused entirely on how to optimize performance. These devices are focused on how to optimize consumer easiness, right? So that people can just watch something and not need a science degree. And performance is kind of the last thing on the list because it's the most expensive. So, so you got to look at the source devices themselves, and then you have to be aware of the content. And in order to get the best playback, sometimes it takes a little bit of research. The newer titles, the blockbusters, Spider-Man, the new Spider-Man movie will be out on the 22nd of this month to consumer formats. Big budget blockbuster movies, those are harder to get wrong because there's so much put into the mix and there's so much care taken in most cases, especially nowadays, to get the true master into the consumer world. But there's so much content that's a little older than that or not quite as gingerly curated. And that's where you have to do a little bit of searching for what is the best available master. So, Gene, does that help kind of clarify what we're talking about?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So what I'm wondering, I don't have a Kaleidoscape yet. It's in the plans to get one here and to do some evaluations. But have you actually compared an Atmos mix streamed through Netflix, the same Atmos mix,
Yes.
streamed through Netflix versus Kaleidoscape, and did you hear a difference between the two?
Well, yeah, I've done streaming on whatever the movie's available on, whether it's Netflix or iTunes or whatever, as long as it's Atmos, as well as same content on Kaleidoscape and same content on 4K Blu-ray, right? So, and it's mixed results in 95% of the cases, either Kaleidoscape or disc wins. And you see it in both the video and you hear it in the audio. Funny enough, you'd think the disc would win all the time because, right, theoretically it has more capacity, etc. But in some cases, the disc capacity is actually not as large as what the Kaleidoscape's master file is. And the Kaleidoscape master file won't fit on a disc. So there is actually a little more compression on the physical disc than the Kaleidoscape, which is, if they have to have 100 gig movie downloaded, that's what they do. So sometimes Kaleidoscape wins, sometimes the disc wins. Very rarely does what we'll call just the standard real-time streaming version win in terms of performance. And sometimes it can be pretty extreme. And sometimes, again, it's every mix is different, and you got to remember, in a lot of cases, and Anthony, you know this firsthand because you worked at Skywalker, like a lot of them, the mixes that are coming into consumer when they're object-based Atmos, they're typically 714. But what the theatrical Atmos object-based mix was with metadata is like 1126 or 926 or there's a lot of, it's not there's a lot more speakers. There's usually front height, on top of your ceiling, sides and backs, and there are more channels being mixed on the actual full-blown theatrical immersive audio than there is available, on most consumer formats.
Right.
So there's some adjustment right off the bat that has to be made in order to fold it down a little bit.
Yeah, we're really not getting the 32 objects we were promised with Atmos mixes in the home, are we?
Well,
you can't, unfortunately.
I mean, the objects can be full, they fold down. I mean, they're there. Right. They're just not discreetly, in parallel speaker sound fields all over the room, because there aren't, 20 or 30 or 40 speakers in most people's home theaters. And really 714, 926, 924, 716, all of those can sound great in a properly done room and give plenty of theatrical experience and really not leave anyone wanting much more. Just like in a larger real commercial theater, if it's done right, whether it's IMAX or whether it's a Dolby Cinema, those can sound amazing, and there are more channels. But there are more channels, but the rooms are a lot bigger. And the sweet spot seating positions are different. So again, I say it all the time because it's so important when you're talking about specs and data and standards. It's context is everything. So a world-class playback environment in a room that's 30 feet deep and 20 feet wide and has 10-foot high ceilings, compared to a stadium seating Dolby Cinema that seats 200 or 300 or more people, that's the context. So now all the discussions about channel counts and seating position and all that, it's going to be totally different. So it's all based on the context. And clearly today we're talking about home theater as the context. So in a home theater environment, we can get world-class playback results even with, a standard, what we'll call immersive audio speaker setup.
So how do we get your mixes in a Kaleidoscape type platform where we're not streaming it real time, but it's being downloaded and we could get the full resolution without compression? I'm talking about the music Atmos mixes, because right now the only way I'm digesting Atmos music is through Tidal or through Apple Music, or some people have Amazon. I think Amazon does streaming, but it's still the Dolby Digital Plus layer. It's still more compressed than what you're actually mixing at the console.
Yeah, well, everything is encoded and decoded at this point. So, I mean, that's kind of the most that you're going to get. I mean, it never even really exists in what we'll call an uncompressed format, like the older multi-channel formats and in stereo PCM. When we talk about, like Anthony was talking about, a 6-channel 24K, 24-bit 96K master, like that's a truly uncompressed, PCM wave file, 6-channel, that's all the data is there. Whatever any system can capture, that's what you're getting at that point. And then as soon as you put it through the encoder, now you're essentially, changing the data stream, the bit stream, the bit rate. And that's really how all the mixes are done now. There isn't really any such thing other than within the system I'm using, which in my case is Pro Tools. If I'm mixing everything in Pro Tools at 2496, that's the only way you would ever hear it natively, is sitting in my studio, because all the mixes that are released that I send in are sent as they do get a WAV file, but really everything is sent as in the Atmos package. So everything is done as an encoded and properly rendered Dolby set of mixes. Mm-hmm. And like Anthony said, it's they shot it out and that was with Dolby Digital Plus and AC3, and we're way past that in terms of what's available for a bitstream and playback data rates. So it sounded close or identical then. I think it sounds really close now. I think the trade-off between what I hear in the studio and what I hear after it's encoded, as long as the playback system is done right, there's very little trade-off. And so all that extra bandwidth that that and all that extra space that a 2496 mix would take is not worth it when you compare it to what's being done with the renderer. Dolby did a really great job with their current renderer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Gene, I wanted to make a quick note. I've done a number of private screening rooms that are what's called DCI certified, which is that they're the people who have them are in the industry, and they're authorized to get the actual master, like to be able to play a movie just like a movie theater does. And there's a lot of logistics and paperwork that goes into getting access to that content. They're in the industry, so they can do it.
The Bel Air circuit.
A Bel Air circuit, however you want to call it. And in those rooms, I've had the opportunity to play a few, either one of the Dolby demo tracks, the Atmos ones, or snippets from a movie, and then the same movie playing off a Blu-ray or an Ultra Blu-ray, and it's pretty damn close. Yep, there are certain elements in the film soundtrack that you can tell in the immersive audio they're just a little bit more precise because the objects are all there. But I would also say that just moving one speaker a little bit will have more effect to change the result than the differences I'm hearing between the DCI and what's on a Blu-ray disc. Not quite so on a streamed result, depending on a bunch of different factors. I wanted to touch on something that David kind of touched on a little bit, which is this. I have heard streaming sound absolutely awesome. Awesome being just the same as an Ultra HD Blu-ray disc, where there's you switch between the two. It's like there's no audible difference. And I've heard it sound terrible in the same track. And some of that depends on, when you're actually streaming, understand that there's bits coming to you from somewhere through probably about 50 or 60 different switches in the interwebs out there before it finally gets to you. And depending on the bandwidth and the availability of data stream along the way, there's a lot of reasons why something that could be glorious one day, the next day may not be glorious. I just say there's a lot of chaos out there. There's a lot of chances. So we sort of sound like we're plugging Kaleidoscape. Neither of us work there. We don't make any money from saying that. But the idea is, if you really want to hear it right, you want the bits in your house. You want them there. And when you hit play, you're not relying on a pipeline that would be variable day by day. I was going to say an analogy like the UPS truck that doesn't show up. It's like you don't really know. So I would say along those lines is that streaming with a decent bandwidth. And I experienced actually at the home of one of our staff people, Chase Walton, if you're watching, hello. He showed me that with, at the time, 60 or 70, was it 70 megabits per second? It wasn't that big of a pipe compared to even what we have now. He could do complete correct HDR with very, very no serious flaws, and completely correct Dolby Atmos. It was perfect. It was like, man, this is coming through correctly compared to the disc material. And then on other days, it doesn't. So if you want reliability, you got to have the physical medium or the bits somewhere stored on a drive somewhere locally. I saw some people on the chat over here. I actually have my phone on, and there's a bunch of chat people ask, well, what if I have the stuff on if I'm using Plex and I have stuff stored somewhere? Well, yeah, that could be good, depending on how you got the program material. But
how your network streams, because if it's on a NAS, it's local. But what you're referring to, Anthony, is one big step more solid than that, which is it's literally playing back directly out of the source outputs. So in the case of a disc, the disc player; in the case of a Kaleidoscape, the Kaleidoscape server playback device. It's not relying on, in most cases anyway, it's not relying on a NAS or a network connection. But of course, your own network, could be a lot more stable than, coming directly off the internet, of course, which you don't know what you're going to get at any given time.
I'm laughing because my NAS sucks. It's old enough now that I can't even open picture files without it going, wah! Time for a new one. To me, the alarm bell is us who care about ultimate sound quality and picture quality. We need to have a voice out there in the industry. We need to make the studios and the video release houses and the streaming companies, that there are people who care. And what's interesting is over time, everybody always talks, oh, it's all going to hell. It's all going worse and worse. Well, not really. TVs are getting bigger. They're getting sharper. For a few $1,000s today, you can buy a display that's just awesome compared to what we all used to struggle with just 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every time I go into Costco, I'm just like amazed what you get for the money. And the sound is also, people going, the sound's getting worse. Like, not so. Sound bars are getting better and better. And so the message is that
it's a good comment right here about the bandwidth. If you don't have good bandwidth, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
From Teo.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people on this watching this, you really want to have at least a gig connection, especially considering how much else is going on in most homes on the internet. People are on their Wi-Fi, and there's a lot more going on than just whatever someone's watching on a movie in terms of internet connection. So you need at least a gig.
So we've covered this, David, before on prior streams. Someone's asking, most people have 5.2.2 or 5.2.4, meaning 5 bed channels and 2 or 4 height channels. Do you really need those back channels? I say yes. If your couch is not up against the back wall,
yes too. I say yes. I mean,
I love the back channels.
It's all relative. Again, it's all context, but yeah, it really, the question sounds like, is there enough of a difference to want to go that far and upgrade a 5.2.2 or a 5.2.4 to a 7, 2.2 or 7, or 5.2.2 or 7.2.4. Yeah, I mean, remember that the Atmos immersive, is a core Dolby Digital Plus, which is 7.1 True HD 7.1 plus the metadata to give it the immersive. So the core right off the bat, before you add any of the objects, is 7.1.4. 7.1, and then the 4 being the back speakers. So the 5.2.4 would be a better setup than the 5.2.2, of course. But really, if you got it, the 7.2.4 is really important because there's a lot happening besides the immersive metadata, the object-based metadata. The sides and the backs are really, really important. When you're going this far, you're truly decoding the soundtrack, and everything else is in check. You should have a minimum of the 4 object-based speakers, and then a core 7.1 setup or 7.2 setup or 7.3 setup, depending on what your setup is, because a lot of processors want to see the front 2 speakers full range to properly render, and then the one subwoofer left over in a 7.3.4 is the LFE, which of course you need, which is the 0.1 typically in a 5.1 or 7.1. So it's actually 7.3.4 if your front speakers are not full range.
Oh, you're saying you're saying doing full range. Go ahead, Anthony.
So I wanted to jump in and go. Why not do 7? Is it a budget thing? Not too many speakers. If you had to choose between where you're putting the speakers, you're better off doing a 7.2, which is the 2 subwoofers. But you're better off doing a 7.2.2 than a 5.2.4. In most movies, there's relatively little going on in the back set of top channels, but a lot more going on in the back. If you actually did a distribution of the amount of energy across the channels in a movie, if you just took 10 movies and you said, well, how often is there energy here? If you could kind of have a little dropper, and every time there was energy in the center, you'd have one drop, you would find that the center channel vial would fill up the most, and then the left and rights would be 3 dB down, half the power. Then the sides would be about 3 dB down, another half the power, and then the backs would be 3 dB down, another half the power. And then it's the front tops. So while those are very exciting when there's a flyover, when something happens over there, they get, in reality, in the case of a movie, they don't really get used that much. So I'm not saying don't do immersive. I'm not saying don't use top channels for immersive audio. It is really exciting. But if for some reason the issue was, I can only afford so much money for speakers, do the back ones before you do the back set of back speakers. Gene mentioned something. If your couch is all the way up against the back wall, then it's kind of hard to get those back speakers to sound right because they're just so close to you
they're
right
too
there that
close.
there's no point in work.
At that
And
point, you can only put ceiling ones and aim them. I mean, other than or not use them at all.
It still doesn't work right. And I've done many rooms in which I've just stuck with 5 channels because the couch is so close. Yep, you'd get something coming out of the speaker, but it would not be referencing the track originally.
Personally, I like to have the back channels just because they're kind of a sound anchor. You know, your height channels are a little bit more forward from that. The last speaker behind you is usually the back channels, and that just gives you that anchor of sound around you. So
right, no, it's important. Now the back channel was invented originally, just in the quick history, with the release of Phantom Menace.
Matrix.
Gary Wrightstrom came to me when I was working at THX. It's like, 5.1 is great, but I just can't get stuff to go behind me really clearly. In Phantom Menace, I want to be able to have stuff in front and the side and the back. I wanted to go all the way around. What are we going to do? So we did a bunch of engineering, figured out how we could create a format that would be compatible backwards and forward, and find a way to code back channel information. And the difference it made on the track, in the original listening of having the ability to play something out of speakers clearly behind you, not just the way side or surrounds are, which is sort of here, but really behind you, was substantial. It's a useful improvement in I would say the bubble, the storytelling bubble that you're in there. So I would definitely go.
So Anthony, I assume you had some involvement in the sound production of Phantom Menace. Like you were there, you were doing, with the EX, with the back channels, right? You got to sit there and you got to talk with Lucas and all those other people that were producing this movie. Why did you allow them to stick so much Jar Jar Binks in that movie? Why didn't you say something when you had the chance to save Star Wars fans from that torture?
Man, I was not involved in that creative decision. Let's not go there. So David, but before we got started, you were talking about, you're starting off, you do a mix, you've got all these channels, and then there's all of these, I don't know what, there's a technical jargon, but there's these versions of
down mixes
that have to go out, down mixes, if you want to call them. There's versions that have to go out to different formats, and those different versions are what they are. You can't cram 65 pounds of sound content into a bag that can only take half a pound. So I'd love to hear you. I interrupted you. It's like, no, I want you to talk about that during the live stream. Do you mind going back to that?
Well, sure. What we were talking about, everyone, is the fact that when there's terms are kind of thrown around sometimes, right? And people will say there's different mixes. Like the binaural's different from the 5.1 and different from the Atmos. And it's not that the mixes are actually different at the source mix. The mix, but it's a little more complicated than that, because there are actual variations of the mix, even though the core mix is the same. You control, as the mixing engineer, through the Dolby renderer, what the alternative non-native mixes are going to sound like. So you do a 714 mix. All the speakers are there in the studio when I'm mixing. That's the native mix. It's 714. If you want to hear exactly what I mixed, you have to play it back 714. If you do that and you decode it through HDMI, through a proper Atmos decoder, with all the speakers set up the way I had them, you'll hear the mix exactly as it was done. However, most people are hearing these mixes, same mix I'm referring to, but they're hearing it either 5.1 or they're hearing it binaural. Of course, the vast majority is binaural. And those versions of the mix, I control what the 5.1 and what the binaural are going to sound like. I can monitor, again, thanks to the renderer, what those different, I can listen to the different mixes versions from my mix. So I'll listen, of course, the majority of the time in the studio natively 714 speakers, or in my case 724, and then I'll put headphones on, mute those speakers in the room, and I'll listen to the binaural, and it's the true binaural mix that I'm hearing. Same thing with 5.1. I'll burn a 5.1 onto an MP4, and I'll go and decode it, listen to it in various playback rooms that I have, and hear what the 5.1 version of the mix sounds like. And eventually you get enough of a sense that after you do a lot of mixes, then you can reference it a little bit less in the different environments, never less in binaural, because that's such a prominent format. But 5.1, I have a real good sense now of how things are going to play back based on what the settings that I use in the renderer are. And then where it gets a little trickier in all of this, and a lot of people can't believe this is the case, but it is, the binaural mix that I do is what you'll hear on Amazon and Tidal and anywhere that you're hearing my binaural mix. But the spatial audio mix is actually Apple's version of my binaural mix, and that can't be monitored. The only way you can do that is because that's a different rendering. They render their own binaural for spatial. So you can't actually hear it ever until it's live, unless you go through this whole process where you send the stereo mix into your iPhone and you put spatial audio on and you go into your AirPods, and it's really, really time consuming compared to what the end result would be. And it's still not accurate because that's not their rendered version. The final version they put out is how it'll actually render. Now they're saying that that's going to change and that we'll have an ability to actually hear the spatial audio mix the way I can hear the binaural coming out of the Dolby renderer, but they're not there yet. So that's the workflow essentially, and how we mix and monitor and vary a mix so that it sounds as great as possible on all the different playback types. I can tell you that when I first started mixing multi-channel 5.1 in the 90s, all the way up till now in Atmos, and this is of course now with the various types of output renders, etc. It's the most complex type of mixing that's ever been done by us mixing engineers. That it really is. You really have to put the time in to understand what these playback formats are going to do to the mix, and you actually get a mix, and you natively it can be spot on 724, and then you listen to the binaural and it's really not sounding like you want it to. So you alter the 724 mix, right? Because that's what's feeding the binaural output render that's happening. Because again, it's all the same mix. And you're going back and forth and just figuring out what is the best blend. And of course, ultimately you want zero compromise in any of the format playback. And that's so it's time consuming, but you can eventually get it so that it's a really compelling 724 for people listening natively, and the binaural sounds really great.
So not to get off topic, and perhaps we could revisit this in a different live stream, but I wonder if this is the reason why we have so many bad Atmos music mixes now, especially from like older music. Maybe either they're trying to optimize it for binaural, or if there's some type of automation going on where they're taking the stems and throwing it through an up mixer at the studio, and they're not really putting any time into actually making discrete sound placements accurately.
Well, that happened a lot when I was doing a lot of DVD mixing in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the trend was very quickly and in very large quantities going from stereo only mixes to now 5.1. And there were content providers that had so much volume that they needed to put out of their content that there weren't enough mixing engineers to do it. And it was more cost effective for them to use like the TC Electronic up mixer and these, kind of set it and forget it, one pass, voila, my stereo mix that I had on the 1990 VHS or Laserdisc version is now multi-channel, and we'll encode it and we're done. And that was happening a lot, of course. I was seeing it. I wasn't a part of it, but I was seeing it happen a lot. And nowadays I'm seeing a lot less of that. And ironically, there's way more content to create in multi-channel than we ever had to do for DVD 20 years ago. and there's less cheating going on in that sense. Now, that's not to say it's not being done, and that's not to say that it won't, be more, kind of accepted in the near future as this push to get so much content out is occurring. But I'm, all the mixes I'm doing and the mixes that I see of my peers are all being, they're true mixes that are being done for multi-tracks or multi, stems are not multi-tracks, but if you get enough stems, you have more than enough control to do a proper mix, So what we're really talking about is when we only get a stereo or a mono file and we're asked to create multi-channel from that. And I'll say something it's really cool. It's really just happened in the last year. There's software that is capable of taking a stereo or mono file and actually creating stems from it. And it's absolutely fascinating, and it works remarkably well. So when I get a stereo file, if that's the only master that exists in the world, and the label or artist is very intent on having it be spatial audio multi-channel, I'll use that software and create a multi-track or a bed of stems from a stereo file. And I'll tell you a funny story. As a lot of people know who are watching this and have followed my career, I've worked with Aerosmith since 1989 very closely, built their studios, worked on all their records, blah, 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 just very kind of intertwined in that world, similar to how Anthony's been in the Lucas world. And the first day that I was brought in to work with Aerosmith, I was told, well, go over there and work on this song with none other than Steven Tyler. And Steven's very intense and very on top of things. And, I was nervous as hell. And it's my first Aerosmith session. I had worked with Tom Hamilton, the bass player, on side projects. Then he introduced me to come into the band's camp. And this was my make or break first day. And the first thing Steven Tyler starts talking to me about is nonlinear hard disk recording, which at the time, unless you had a Synclavier or a Fairlight MFX or a Waveframe, it was a 2-channel world for that. And so we started getting into this whole conversation about editing 2-channel on hard disk and all these things. And he said to me, wait a second. And he kind of got confused for a minute. And he said, are you saying we can take a 2-channel mix and we can create a multi-track? And this was in 1989, which was the year I started with them. We were working on the Pump album, and we were actually working on the song Janie's Got a Gun at this moment that this story occurred. And I said, no, Steven, no, you can't. And I'm thinking to myself, are you crazy? You can't take a 2-channel finished master and extract a multi-track. That's like Star Trek. And we both kind of laughed it off. And now here I am with software that actually does it. I'll never forget that story. I called Steven up when I tried the software and it worked so well. I said, you're not going to believe this. You are vindicated. What I thought was one of the craziest things anybody ever came up with is actually real right now. And I took a stereo mix of Sweet Emotion just off the CD and burned it and then made it into a multi-track and sent them like just a minute fun mix where I was like soloing vocals and dropping out drums and like things you could only do with a multi-track, but I got it off the CD. But that's how good this software is.
Wow.
And he was just like, oh my God, it's here, it happened. And so the tools that we have and some of the things that we're able to do under the gun, are very, very expansive.
Awesome. Well, I think we're passing the hour mark. The one last thing I wanted to basically recap on, 2 things actually. Number one, if you really care about the quality of what you're listening to or watching, if it's a really special movie, like let's say the new Dune movie or Blade Runner 2049, get the optical version of it. Or if you have the Kaleidoscape, buy the rights to that movie and watch it on that platform as opposed to streaming it through your streaming device. I think that's the end of the day. If you want the best sound quality, picture quality, that's the way you do it. But the question I have, I guess, for Anthony or David or both is, we're talking about how a lot of these movies now are coming out as near field mixes because Anthony, you showed us how they're setting up the speakers in the studio. Is there like a call to action there? I mean, I know we're the 0.1% of the industry, but if Tom Cruise could get on TV and say, turn off the soap opera effect on video, then maybe we could be saying stop doing the near field mixes, or just maybe bring some more attention to it. So that way, when you get a mixing engineer that's really intent on making a good transfer for home, maybe they rethink it without having any penalties to the actual soundbar people.
Yeah, I go ahead, David.
No, I'm
Oh,
no, yeah, it was directed to you. It's a great question for you.
it is a good question. I think there is a call to action, which is to raise awareness that there is a way to just keep the mix as it is, and really ultimately, I'm going to say something that's probably impossible, but educate the client that when they have a TV with little speakers like this that are firing down, don't expect to get good dialogue clarity, and don't complain to your video release company, however it is that you're getting the track. Just understand you've got crap gear. Sorry, and I know it's really hard to accept to do that, but doing a race to the bottom with the lowest common denominator just in the history of everything just leads to poor quality all the way around. So,
and Anthony, would you agree that it's a someone who's done so many great systems as yourself? It's the links in the chain. I think people miss that a lot. Is that they'll buy like the best amps or the best processor or the best projector, and the rest of it is not up to reference quality, and it's just a chain that's going to snap.
Right, somewhere along the way, there's an error in the link. So the first thing is dialogue clarity. That's the first thing that everybody is complaining about, and the fact is that the sound that's made to come out of one speaker, either behind an acoustically transparent screen, as it's supposed to be, or right below, whatever, is never going to sound that clear over a pair of speakers out of two of them with interfering comb filters firing down. Okay, so now what? Are you going to like redo the mix to put like a 2 kilohertz, like an octave wide 6 dB bump at 2 kilohertz to try to make it sound hello? Well, you could, and people are going to understand it. But then what you're doing is you're altering the artist's intention, and that's just not okay. So it is not that hard for a TV manufacturer to have a mode on their TV that does push the mid-range. Do it on the playback.
Super chat, thank you.
Yeah, do it on the playback. Do it in the TV, and so ask, complain to the TV manufacturer. Go back to them and go, I bought this TV. It's a beautiful TV, but the sound is unintelligible. Doing dynamic range containment in the TV is not that hard either. Both by using the dynamic range compression that's available in the Dolby mode, or just, David, you know what a compressor is? Just, push the bottom up, crank the bottom down, and develop that. And that's a really simple thing to do right in the TV, so as to not mess it up for everybody else. The night mode, actually, there wasn't a lot of surround processors many years ago.
Yep, I remember that. So David, I'm sorry, Anthony, one last question that's in our chat here I wanted to address. So I've noticed this as well on some of the forums. There's people that go in and they re-EQ the lost bass in movies. I don't know if you're familiar with this. They call it BEQ, bass EQ. What are your thoughts on that? Personally, it's rare that I find a movie that doesn't have enough bass, but I've got 4 subwoofers properly calibrated. Is this an issue with some of the mixes, or is it just a bad calibration in a lot of cases?
It's funny. This is a Pandora's box, actually. So know that the 0.1 track, when you take a 5.1, 7.1, 20.1, doesn't really matter. The 0.1 track, when you down mix it to 2-channel, gets dropped out.
Yeah.
And the film industry generally only uses a 0.1 track when they have a need for extra bass than the speakers can really handle, and they need to shuttle out a different way. That is how that was originally developed. We're going back many years, the baby boom tracks on 70 millimeter stereo. Now, I know people who mix for TV or mix for music in which they put all the bass in the 0.1 track, and that's going to get lost when you play it in 2 channels. So how do you get it back? You can't get it back. It's gone.
Well, we're talking about playing a surround sound track. So people are saying that they're 5.1 or Atmos tracks, they don't have a lot of bass, and they're going in.
I don't know, dude. I don't know what you're doing wrong, but there's. I was going to use some foul language. There's a lot of bass in those tracks, and so if it's not playing right, You either need to check your settings in your surround decoder, because some of them actually have the ability to take the LFE ratio and turn it down from where it's supposed to be 10 dB down, 20 dB down further, or in dB
Set it
steps.
to 0.
Make sure that's where it's supposed to be. One, make sure your bass is calibrated. Make sure you don't have standing wave problems, because Murphy's first law of room acoustics is wherever you're going to want to sit, there's going to be a giant hole around 60 hertz because of standing waves. And if you just have one subwoofer in the front of the room, or if you're running your big speakers full range, right where you sit, there's no bass. You get up, you move forward 2 feet, it's all there. You go back, it's all there right where you're sitting. And you don't equalize the track for that. You fix your room.
You move your seats.
Your subwoofer location. Move your seat. Take the subwoofer, move it down the wall a little bit. So other than that, there is no need to do anything inside the track to the 0.1 to get even more bass than's already there, which is way lots.
And when we were mixing 5.1 music in the mid 90s, there were a couple of years where there was just a ton of 20-bit CDs coming out of just 5.1 music. And I was asked to go and meet with some really great peers of mine, engineers that I respected tremendously, but they had never mixed in 5.1. Their 2-channel mixes were iconic, but their 5.1 mixes they had never done. And the first thing that every one of them did at first, now we fixed this, of course, in most cases, or at least the ones I consulted on, we fixed. I'm sure there were many that I didn't. And I don't know what happened in those cases. But the first thing I saw every engineer do, I won't mention names, but they're all world famous names, is put all the bass, thinking, oh, the bass goes in the 0.1. And just, they had no experience in home theater. They had no experience in the consumer world or the movie world. And they just didn't know. They just thought subwoofer, bass. And it was very quick to explain how it all worked and what the role of the 0.1 LFE is. But, I can see how an engineer who is only working in one lane of mixing would, I saw it firsthand, and I'm sure it still happens today. It's that they just don't understand how the 0.1 plays back in the home and what the role of it is, and how important it is to mix it and blend it correctly at its most simplest, in its most simplest form, and the most simple explanation. The LFE 0.1, low frequency effect, it is truly an effect. Added bottom, added bass dynamics. It's not where the bass goes. It's where the bass is a little more emotionally expressed, a little deeper, a little bigger thud on the dinosaur, walking through the forest. But without it, it's still a very full range, complete mix when done right.
Gene, I'm going to suggest that this topic alone could be an entire hour of a live stream. And you could go, why bother? Because bass is important.
Oh yeah.
That bottom 2 octaves is a lot.
We obsess over it.
Well, but in music too. Yeah. If you don't have a good, if you're listening to harpsichord concertos, we don't need to worry about it. But on full range music, the bottom 2 octaves need to be right. There's a lot of misconception about how you produce and how you play it back. I'm not going to mention it now, but there is a reason why the LFE was developed that people don't really know about, and I'd love to do that. This is a pitch for us to get together again later and stop for tonight to just talk about 0.1. Was it 4? How do you use it? How do you play it back? How do you make it work?
Yep.
How to set your
levels.
levels.
So much confusion in what the -10 rule is and the -20, and I mean it's true. It's a whole conversation we should pause.
Well, we will schedule that in the near future. We'll just do one just on the 0.1 and how to set your bass levels, because I think part of the reason why some people may think there's not enough bass in movies could be they don't have not only just the standing wave issue, like you said, but maybe their bass levels are too flat. Maybe they don't have the bass elevated enough with the relative to the rest of the speakers. So we could do a whole video just on that, and it's always welcome to, because we are bassaholics and audioholics. But guys, I wanted to thank you, Anthony, David. It was awesome having the two of you on our channel, giving different perspectives on the same topic. It's awesome to just get this diverse opinion from experts. I hope you guys found this video useful. Please give us some comments down below. on future broadcasts you'd like to see us collaborate on relative to Atmos mixes or bass levels or anything that you just have questions on. Give us some comments down below. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. We appreciate your support. You get direct access to us if you want to suggest video topics or if you just want to ask questions. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.
Enjoy